The wedding dress felt heavy on my shoulders. I remember looking at myself in the mirror that morning, trying to recognize the girl inside it. She looked calm, beautiful even, but I knew that behind the makeup there was a quiet storm. I was 20 years old, and I was about to marry a man I barely knew. Everyone around me said it was a good match. They said his family was rich and respected, that he would take care of me. I smiled and said thank you, but in my heart I felt small and powerless. In my family, daughters did not choose. From childhood, I had learned that obedience was love. A good daughter listens. A good daughter agrees. So when my father told me about the proposal, I nodded. I told myself this was normal, that marriage would bring happiness later. I wanted to believe that love could grow after marriage, the way people said it did. The wedding was beautiful. Flowers everywhere, music, guests laughing and clapping. I smiled for photos, held my husband's hand, and played my part. Everyone thought I was the luckiest woman in the world. But inside, I felt like a stranger watching someone else's life. That night, when the lights went off, I stared at the ceiling and wondered what I had done. The first few months were quiet. My husband was polite but distant. He worked late and spent most evenings on his phone or laptop. When he did speak, it was about practical things, money, business, travel. I tried to please him, to be kind, to smile, but his eyes never stayed on me for long. Sometimes he forgot simple things, like my birthday or what I liked to eat. I told myself he was busy, that men showed love differently, but each night I felt more invisible. One evening, while arranging the wardrobe, I found a small envelope in his drawer. Inside was a document I didn't understand at first. It was our marriage agreement. It looked like a contract, written in legal terms, with signatures and dates. There was a line that said the marriage would last for a minimum of 1 year, renewable by consent. My hands shook as I read those words again and again. I realized my marriage was not built on love or family. It was a deal. I sat on the bed for a long time, trying to breathe. He came home late that night. I wanted to ask him, to shout, to demand an answer, but no sound came out of my mouth. I felt small and weak. I went to sleep pretending everything was fine. The next morning, I looked at him across the table and forced a smile. That was the moment I decided to live quietly until I could understand what to do. Days turned into weeks. I started painting again to fill the silence. I had loved art since childhood. Colors had always spoken to me in ways people couldn't. When I painted, I felt free, like the world outside didn't exist. My husband never noticed my paintings. Sometimes he looked at them with confusion, as if they were useless. But I didn't stop. They were my secret way of breathing. One evening, he told me he was going abroad for business. He didn't ask if I wanted to come. He simply said, "It's better if you stay." I nodded again like a good wife. He left the next morning. For the first time, I felt something strange. Relief. The house was quiet, but it was my silence now. I painted for hours, cooked my favorite food, listened to soft music. For the first time since my wedding, I didn't have to pretend. But peace never stays long. After 3 months, he came back. I saw another side of him then, cold, angry, impatient. He shouted when I asked questions. He didn't want to talk. One night, after an argument, he looked at me with sharp eyes and said, "Don't forget, this is only a contract." The words hit me like a knife. I didn't reply. I walked to the other room and sat by the window. I stayed there until morning, watching the sky change color. Something inside me broke quietly that night. The following week, my father came to visit. He spoke kindly, asked if everything was fine. I wanted to tell him the truth, but I couldn't. My family had given me to this man. If I told them the truth, it would shame them. So I smiled and said I was happy. When he left, I cried for a long time. I felt trapped between duty and pain. Then, one rainy evening, everything changed. My husband and I were returning from his friend's wedding. The road was wet and dark. He was driving fast, talking on the phone. I asked him to slow down, but he waved his hand. A few minutes later, the car slid across the road and hit the barrier. The world turned upside down. I remember glass flying through the air, the sound of metal twisting, my body shaking. When I opened my eyes, everything hurt. The smell of smoke and fuel filled my nose. My husband crawled out through the broken window. I tried to call him, but he didn't hear me. He ran to get help. I couldn't move. The pain in my back was sharp and deep. People came running from nearby houses. They pulled me out carefully, but every movement felt like fire. I heard someone shouting for an ambulance before everything went dark again. When I woke up, I was in a hospital bed. My body was covered in bandages. My arm was broken. My ribs hurt with every breath, and I couldn't feel my legs. I turned my head and saw my husband sitting in the corner. His face looked pale and tired. He didn't say much. The next morning, he left for work as usual. I lay there staring at the ceiling, wondering if this was my punishment for living a lie. Days turned into weeks. Doctors came and went. They told me my spine was badly injured. I might not walk again. I listened quietly, my eyes dry. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just felt empty. When they left the room, I whispered to myself, "So this is my new life." The nights were the worst. The room was silent except for the ticking clock. I couldn't sleep. I thought about my parents, my marriage, my choices. Everything felt like someone else's story. One morning, a nurse brought me a small notebook and said, "You can write or draw if you want. It helps some people." I opened the book slowly. My hand shook, but I began to draw. My lines were weak, but they were mine. For the first time in months, I felt something inside me come alive. As the days passed, I started to paint again on small pieces of paper. The nurse smiled each time she saw them. Soon, other patients came to look. They said the colors were bright and full of hope. But they didn't see the tears that fell while I painted. They didn't feel the pain in every brushstroke. My husband didn't visit often. He said hospitals made him sad. I stopped expecting him. 2 months later, the doctor came to my room with a serious face. He said they would start therapy soon, but it would take time. I listened and nodded. I had already decided that no matter how broken my body was, I wouldn't give up. That night, I stared at the ceiling and made a promise to myself. I would live for me, not for anyone else. I didn't know how, but I knew I had to start. The next morning, I asked for a wheelchair. When they brought it, I touched its cold handles and took a deep breath. It felt strange at first, like sitting in a cage. But then I realized it was also my freedom. I could move again, even if slowly. I rolled myself to the window and looked at the sunlight falling on the floor. It looked warm and alive. I whispered softly, "This is my new beginning." Before I continue with the story, please like, subscribe, share, and let me know in the comments where you are listening from. Your support means a lot. Now, let's continue. When I returned home from the hospital, the house felt different. Everything looked the same, but I saw it with new eyes. The walls, the furniture, the smell of his perfume in the air all reminded me of the woman I used to be. That woman was gone. I was no longer the quiet wife who said yes to everything. I was someone broken, yet still breathing. The first few days were hard. My husband hired a nurse to help me, but he was rarely home. Sometimes I heard him laughing on the phone in the other room. I didn't ask who he was talking to. I had no energy for arguments. I spent most of my time in the living room, near the big window where sunlight fell in the afternoon. I watched people walking on the street, children playing, old women carrying groceries. I wondered if they ever thought about how lucky they were to walk on their own feet. Every morning, I tried to move my legs. The doctor had said there was a small chance I could walk again, but deep inside, I knew that hope was thin. My hands were weak too, but I still wanted to paint. One day, I asked the nurse to bring my paints and brushes. She smiled and said it was a good idea. When I touched the brush again, I felt life returning to me. My hand shook, but I didn't stop. The first picture was of a sunrise. The colors were uneven, but to me it was beautiful because it meant I was trying. As weeks passed, I painted every day. Sometimes the nurse watched me quietly. Other times, she helped mix the colors. I painted my pain, my silence, and my small moments of joy. When my husband noticed the paintings, he said nothing. He only looked for a second and then walked away. That silence used to hurt, but I learned to see it as freedom. He no longer had power over what I created. One afternoon, my younger brother came to visit. He brought me flowers and a book about famous painters who overcame disability. As I turned the pages, I saw pictures of people who had lost their sight, their limbs, or their movement, but still created art that touched hearts. It made me think about strength. Pain changes you, but it also shows who you really are. Months passed. My husband became a stranger in the same house. He stopped eating at home. When he spoke, his words were short and tired. I could feel he wanted to leave. I could have begged him to stay, but I didn't. I knew something he didn't know. I had already started to build a life without him. I had joined an online art group for people with disabilities. We shared our work, our stories, and our struggles. For the first time in years, I felt seen. Then one evening after dinner, he looked at me and said, "I think we should end this. You deserve someone better." I looked at him quietly. My heart was calm. There was no anger, no shock, only peace. I had been waiting for this moment. I said yes. He looked surprised, maybe even guilty, but I didn't care. The next week we signed the divorce papers. When he walked out of the house with his suitcase, I watched him from my wheelchair. The same man I once called my husband was leaving, and I felt nothing but relief. That night, I slept deeply for the first time in years. There was no fear, no noise, no pretending. After the divorce, people talked. Some relatives called and asked what had gone wrong. Others said I should have been more patient. I listened quietly. When I hung up, I smiled to myself. People always think they know what is best for others, but they don't live our pain. A few weeks later, I moved to a smaller apartment near the city center. It was on the ground floor, so I could go outside easily. I filled it with bright colors, paintings, and plants. I called it my new home. The neighbors were kind. A little girl from next door often came to watch me paint. She asked many questions, and I liked her curiosity. Sometimes she helped me clean my brushes. Her laughter filled the room like sunlight. One day she asked, "Why do you paint so many skies?" I told her that skies change every day, just like people. Sometimes they are bright, sometimes full of clouds, but they always keep moving. She nodded and said, "Then you are like the sky." Her words stayed with me for days. Soon, I started selling my paintings online. A small art magazine wrote about my story. They called me the woman who paints hope. I didn't feel like a hero, but I was happy that my work touched others. It gave meaning to the pain I had lived through. But inside me, there was still an empty place. I had always wanted to be a mother. When the doctors told me that my injury had damaged my spine and that I could never have children, I had accepted it in silence. But acceptance does not mean the heart forgets. Every time I saw a mother with her baby, something inside me ached. One evening, while watching television, I saw a story about a couple who adopted a little girl from a shelter. The child was smiling in the picture, holding her new mother's hand. That night, I couldn't sleep. I thought about love, about giving, and about the children who had no one to hold them. The next morning, I searched for adoption agencies on my computer. The process was long and full of questions. They asked about my health, my income, and how I would care for a child in a wheelchair. I answered everything honestly. Some people at the agency looked doubtful. I saw it in their eyes, but I didn't give up. I told them that love doesn't walk, it lives inside the heart. After many visits and interviews, they finally accepted my application. Months passed. Each time the phone rang, I hoped it would be the agency. Sometimes it was, but they only said they were still looking. I waited with patience, even when it was hard. My paintings became brighter during that time. I painted dreams of small hands and soft smiles. Then one morning my phone rang again. It was the agency. The woman on the other end said, "There is a baby boy. He is 2 days old. Would you like to meet him?" My heart began to race. Tears filled my eyes. I said yes before she even finished speaking. That afternoon, I went to the center. They brought the baby to me, wrapped in a white blanket. He was tiny, with soft black hair and closed eyes. When I held him, he opened his eyes slowly and looked at me. In that moment, something inside me healed. I felt complete. I whispered his name and promised to protect him with all my heart. The first nights were difficult. He cried often, and I was still learning how to move with the wheelchair. But when I looked at his small face, every difficulty disappeared. I realized that motherhood is not only about giving birth. It is about giving love, patience, and care. My son brought new colors into my world. He smiled when I painted, as if he understood that colors were my way of breathing. I painted us together, me holding him, surrounded by bright light. I called that painting New Beginning. It became one of my favorites. Sometimes I thought about my past, but I didn't feel pain anymore. The woman who once said yes to everything had learned to say no when it mattered. I was not living the life I had imagined, but it was mine. And that made it beautiful. Life with my son changed everything. My days became full again. I woke up to the sound of his small voice and the touch of his tiny hands. Each morning, sunlight came through the window and touched his face, and I felt thankful to be alive. The pain in my back was still there, but it no longer controlled me. When I looked at him, I felt strong. I learned how to do everything in my wheelchair. I learned how to hold him, feed him, and rock him to sleep. At first, I was afraid I would not be enough, but love has a way of teaching us what to do. I sang to him softly each night and told him stories about stars, oceans, and dreams. He was too young to understand, but his eyes followed my voice, and that was enough. Outside the house, the world was not always kind. People looked at me with surprise or pity. Some asked questions that hurt. Others whispered behind my back. I tried to ignore them, but sometimes their looks made me feel small. I understood that many people could not see beyond the wheelchair. They saw a broken body, not a living soul. One afternoon, I went to a small park near my house. My son was sleeping in his stroller, and I was sitting quietly, watching the trees move in the wind. A woman nearby stared at me for a long time before she said, "You are brave." I smiled and said thank you, but her words stayed in my mind. I didn't feel brave. I had not chosen this life. It had happened to me. But maybe courage is not a choice. Maybe courage is what grows inside us when life leaves us no other way. Over time, more people began to notice my art. A local television channel invited me to speak about my painting